welcome everyone to the Thoughtworks Technology Radar Volume 24. This is the 24th time we have done a technology radar. And so let's get started with our sneak peek. The radar is coming out soon, and what we do every time a new radar is coming out is we do a sneak peek webinar to give you some highlights about some of the content that will show up on the next edition of our radar. So let's go ahead and get started. Can you move to the next slide, please? Okay, so my name is Neil Ford. I'm a director and a meme wrangler here in Thoughtworks North America. I'm joined today by two of the members of the Doppler group. That is the group within Thoughtworks that puts together the technology radar that we're going to be talking about today. I'm joined today by Brandon Byers, who's the technical director of North America, and his voice will sound like this.
Hey folks, how you doing?
And also by Cassie Shum, head and technical director of cloud partnerships in North America, and her voice will sound like this.
Hello, everyone.
And it will be easy to tell them apart, which is good. And as I said, my name is Neil Ford. I am your moderator for today. So let me describe a little bit, very briefly, about what this radar thing is, in case you've stumbled into this but don't know what a technology radar is. This is a publication that we produce twice a year. It is a crowdsourced from actual project work within Thoughtworks. It is basically, we're projecting our opinions about technology out into the marketplace so that people can take advantage of some of our experience on software projects. It is modeled metaphorically after a radar, which is why it's called the technology radar. And we have 4 rings in our radar. Starting from the center, we have adopt. Those are things that are no-brainer technology choices. If you have this problem, this is the appropriate technology because it excels at solving a particular problem. Things that are in trial are things that are in active research and development. And in fact, for us to go in trial, it has to be in production on at least one project, which is a pretty high bar for us. Assess is a lower bar. Those are things that look really interesting and look promising, and we're starting to experiment with, but haven't made a definitive judgment yet. And then our only negative ring is hold. This doesn't mean you should instantly stop using something, but instead you should not start anything new or proceed with caution, because we've seen this used problematically by our clients or out in the wide world. And so we get together as a group now virtually for the 3rd time, twice a year. We crowdsource all these, what we call blips, and go through a big conversation and ultimately yield this radar document. It is in several different categories: techniques, languages and frameworks, tools and platforms. But interestingly, today, our 2 speakers have chosen only techniques. And so this is an interesting departure from most of our sneak peeks, which include a variety of things from, we got different rings, but they're all, interestingly enough, techniques today, which is usually one of our fullest quadrants, because there are a lot of techniques worth talking about. And so let's talk about some of the content that you will see on volume 24, which is coming up soon. As our speakers are speaking, feel free to ask questions in Q&A, and we will answer them as we come to them. So let's get started with some of the content of volume 24.
Awesome. Thank you, Neil, for that great intro. So let's dive right in. I'll get started with our first technique is cloud sandboxes. And we have moved this, or no, this is new in trial. And so as Neil mentioned earlier, we tend to put things in trial when we've had a few teams really talk about it, and it's starting to swarm as a bit of a trend that we're seeing on some of our clients. So one of the things that we've talked about in terms of cloud sandboxes is really, cloud in itself, as we know, is becoming more and more of a commodity as years are going by. And so being able to spin up cloud sandboxes in order to, test in more of a development environment is much, much easier to scale. It's much more available at scale. And we're seeing a lot of our different project teams really preferring a cloud only as opposed to the local environments that we're traditionally used to, right? So a few reasons for this. This is really to reduce a lot of the maintenance complexity. We don't really want to see a lot of these snowflake local sandbox, local development environments. And really, if you're standardizing on some of these cloud sandboxes, using infrastructure as code, using things like Terraform, and really being able to spin up these environments very quickly and at a standardized method, we find that to be much, much better for testing. I think one of the things that we have seen as well and have tried on different teams is really about, the tooling to do the local simulation of cloud native services really limits, our confidence in the developer builds and the test cycles and things like that. So this is actually why we're preferring these cloud sandboxes over some of these local simulations. Some of the key enablers, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is really around being mature enough to think about the infrastructure as code, really automating your pipelines. Without this, we can say cloud sandbox is all we want, but you need to actually be, this tall in order to really, get to the benefits of being able to scale cloud sandboxes as you're developing testing bed. Some of the things as well is really having a good onboarding practice for your developers coming onto your teams, coming onto your organization, and being able to enable these cloud sandboxes for them as well. So having that process in place is really important before you get started. And one of the things that, this is in trials. So this is something that we always caution with, just instead of saying, hey, let me just go all the cloud sandboxes for my organization. Some of the risks that we want to call out is there could be a bit of a slower feedback loop from a development point of view. So really think about the cost benefit analysis of the standardization over that feedback cycle and how slow is that cycle. So really paying attention to those metrics. And really, like, a big conversation that was happening in the Doppler around this idea is, now you as a developer has a really, really strong dependency on being connected to the cloud. So if you don't have great Wi-Fi, or you don't have great internet or the connectivity, especially with all of us being remote at home, then really think about your organization and making sure that your developers always have that, internet connectivity, so you can actually connect to a lot of these cloud sandboxes. So just something to consider when you're thinking about this. And of course, we strongly recommend adopting some really lean governance practices regarding some of the standardizations around these sandbox environments, especially with security, IAM, regional deployments, things like that. So yeah, that's our first flip that we're talking about. The next one, Brandon, to you.
Just a real quick transitional note. Looking at the Q&A there, Rainer wasn't clear what a cloud sandbox actually is. Do you want to give just a 30-second definition, and I'll drive this one, Cassie?
Oh, sure. Sorry, I was just looking at the question. So yeah, no, essentially, a cloud sandbox is really, an instance where multiple developers can actually connect to, and that there is a standardized like Kubernetes cluster, like EKS or GKE or something that's already provisioned within the cloud, and that developers can actually feed into that in order to actually test some of their local changes and things like that.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, so opposed to a local development and the ability to metaphorically work on an airplane. I guess that doesn't quite work nowadays when airplanes themselves have Wi-Fi. So this one is what I'm excited about. We have given some airplay before to hypothesis-driven development. This is a specific take on it in the context of what we call legacy renovation. So I was particularly drawn to this one because I've been on a few large-scale legacy modernization programs of work, or maybe you're thinking about replacing a very large mainframe, very long-standing and heavily customized ERP. And if there is a harder problem in IT, then I've not come across it. And I think what tends to happen is a lot of times organizations, especially once you have such a long-standing software asset that's run the business, you start to take it for granted, and you start to forget how much complexity has gone into it over the years. And you've lost that knowledge, because if it's a 40-year-old system, it's outlived an entire career of an individual or come close to it. And so the knowledge of what's in that system has been exited from the organization. We tend to attempt those programs with the same planning processes that work for greenfield product development a lot of times, where there's still clearly learning baked into it, but we can get a lot of predictability through sort of story definition, estimation, yesterday's weather, and kind of a lot of techniques that grew up in the early days of agile planning. But those are really hard to apply when every single story is a learning expedition. Every single story is an archaeological dig into a legacy system, and you really don't know how deep that rabbit hole goes. So what I like about this technique is it's saying, hey, let's change that planning process. Let's actually recognize that learning is the core function that we need, because to be able to replace the system, we have to actually understand what it does to begin with. And let's make some hypotheses instead of user stories around what we think we can do as the next iteration of that modernization effort. And let's have a time box learning activity that allows us to validate or invalidate that hypothesis, and then frame the next set of hypothesis moving forward. So it's a different way of framing the planning process around really complex legacy initiatives in a way that explicitly captures the learning necessary for it and the unpredictability of the overall effort. Because we're really fooling ourselves when we think we can just create a 2-year time frame for something that complex.
Well, I think it's a great way to avoid analysis paralysis too, because you can start doing stuff right away and not just think about doing stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think really the key insight is, instead of optimizing for a predictable outcome, we need to optimize for reducing uncertainty. Because that's what kills these projects, is the amount of uncertainty that goes into them. And we get a false sense of security that we know more than we actually do, especially the further removed from the actual work we are. So this is a good way of communicating that uncertainty and managing it in a way that the organization can make forward momentum with.
Great. We've got a couple of questions about cloud sandboxes, but I want to move forward. And so we'll keep moving forward. We'll pick up and answer some of those questions as we come back. So please keep adding questions. You're doing a great job. But now we're going to move back to techniques and some more blips.
Great. Yeah, no, I haven't been looking at Q&A, so I can go ahead and do those after I'm done presenting this next flip. So this next flip is really around platform engineering product teams. And so one of the things, again, we've been seeing as across all of our teams is really the thought, and I'm sure everyone's used this word, the platform team. Like, what are these platform teams and these internal platform teams and things like that? So we absolutely think it is something that all high-performing IT companies need to adopt. Obviously, we have a few caveats that come with that, but really, this is thinking more about creating and supporting internal platforms. And so, when you think about creating software for your customer, we want to really take that customer-driven approach. In this case, your customer are your engineering teams, are your developers. They're the ones who are actually creating the feature for your clients. So essentially, these internal platforms is really to enable a much quicker speed to market, which is actually a theme that Brandon's going to talk about in a bit. But really talking about the team in itself, I think that the concept here is, again, the customer as being the engineer, the developer, and really using the idea of defining, different KPIs and using that lean iterative development cycle to really drive out what is the need of the engineer in order to make them go faster in developing, some of these really differentiated features for the customer. So this is actually a very strong adopt that we have. A few things to think about is really when when you think about your platform, a lot of times it's kind of that bucket that everybody wants to put everything into, and all of the, non-functional requirements, let's just put it in there. Instead of thinking about it that way, we really want folks, again, to think about the customer as an engineer and really looking at the platform into logical decoupled capabilities, right? These capabilities that are going to enable the developers and engineers to remove a lot of that cognitive overhead and that cognitive complexity, some of the standardization practices in order to drive, a faster speed to market and things like that. So one of the things we don't want people to do is actually, take, the historical existing technology silos and kind of bucket them into what we call a platform, right? Just put a label of platform over it, because you're really not solving the problem of really looking at the different, capabilities that is needed to drive some of these internal platforms. So being able to really look at what that actually looks like. Also, one of the things that we suggest is using concepts from team topologies. And that is, we can probably send the website through on the Q&A, but really that's how you best organize platform teams and really look and see how those can be driven out. So more to come on the platform in itself and the themes, but that's just a nice technique that we are strongly pushing them to adopt.
One of the details that gets hidden in the flatness of the radar is how much conversation happens around particular blips, because some of them have just a little bit of conversation and some of them have a whole lot of conversation. And this one had a whole lot of conversation in our last meeting, so much so that it yielded both a blip and a theme, which Brandon's going to talk about in a bit.
So continuing my enthusiasm for new approaches to legacy remediation and modernization, this blip, SPA injection, SPA refers to a single page application. It's inspired by what has become a fairly well-known pattern that Martin Fowler coined around the Strangler application, or it's actually the Strangler Fig application in his original formulation. And that idea of a Strangler Fig approach to legacy modernization came from a trip that he did to the rainforest in Australia. And the Strangler Figs have to solve the same problem that all plants have to solve, which is first, I need sun. And that's hard to get at the floor of the rainforest. So they took a different evolutionary approach and they started at the top, the trees, so they could get the sunlight. But that creates the next problem of how do they maintain structural integrity while they're growing until they can replace the tree that they're hosting on, because they grow down around the tree and using the trunk as that stable structure that allows them to iteratively move down until they can plant the roots in the ground, and eventually the tree itself can die, and the Strangler Fig is completely self-sustained at that point. So that's a good sort of outside-in metaphor for how we do a lot of legacy modernizations, because you don't have to replace the entire thing in one big bang. You could use the stable structure of the legacy system, but capture some of the events outside of it, do some additional processing, feature development, and over time you can absorb more of the functionality of the core system. It's only quite recent that single page applications have entered our vernacular. It's less than a decade old. So it's not surprising that we're only just now getting to replacing single page applications. They themselves have become legacies in need of replacing. And as we're doing a few of these, we realize that the pattern is actually a little bit different than what we tend to think of with the Strangler Fig approach. Instead of starting outside and sort of absorbing functionality from the legacy system, we're actually starting inside of it. So if we have an AngularJS application, the original version of Angular, and we want to replace it with React, we don't go off on the side and build a completely separate React application in some big bang fashion, replace the site. We can actually embed the beginnings of the React single page application into the same document structure, and it can grow inside the document structure and start to encroach on the territory that the AngularJS legacy application used to provide. So it's more of an inside out approach than what the Strangler Fig pattern describes as being outside in. It's very specific to the browser context because the HTML document now is that stable structure that you're attaching to, and the two spas can live side by side or contained within each other. But it does provide a path for an iterative replacement of legacy systems, which is the key success factor that we see. Is if you're going to replace something large and complex, you need to be able to do it iteratively and manage your risk, which means you need to be able to rely on the legacy system for a period of time. This allows you to do that in the context of single page applications.
All right, let's keep this party going. So next technique that we'll talk about is a bit of a switch, is really around remote mob programming. And so we're actually looking to assessing this. So as we mostly are all remote these days, we're trying to look at a practice that we have been using for many, many, many years. So it's a technique to really enable teams to really collaborate on different technical issues and stories and defects. So as we were talking through this in Doppler, I actually remember, back when we were in team rooms together, we would book out a room, get the projector up, and really share somebody's IDE and really kind of swarm on some of these design decisions. Some of these, it could be just a defect that developers are really swarming around and trying to fix together. This collaboration is quite important for many reasons, really for team cohesion, for onboarding, for a lot of different areas, and really also, as we know, like different design styles, as all of our developers, have, how do we actually align on a few of those things, have some standardization? So being able to do a lot of mob programming and swarming around these type of issues have been really, really important. So one of the things that we're assessing is really, what does remote mob programming actually look like? So we have seen and heard from a few of our teams who really try to be more intentional about setting up mob programming sessions from a remote point of view. And I think that's actually quite important to really assess now, because as we are very remote right now, it's much easier to lose sight of that collaboration. It's easier to try to figure out a problem yourself than really reach out to your team members. And the benefit of that just completely outweighs, struggling with something for many, many hours. And it really binds that team back together. And it's really about that intentionality in this remote mob programming that we were really excited about. So something that we wanted to bring up as a technique to really, in your teams, as you're all remote now, put it on the calendar, say let's have a weekly remote mob programming session, and have any developer come in with any issue or any question or things like that, and really make that a practice within your team space, especially in a remote sense.
It's actually one of the few things that's easier when everybody's remote than when you're all live, because you don't have to find a precious meeting room and a projector and all that, because you're already sitting there and you can all just join a Zoom meeting. So it's one of the few affordances that everybody being trapped at home allows us. So we should take advantage of it.
Yeah, absolutely. We should definitely take advantage of it. So this is a great one I'm pretty excited about. The next one.
So this is a different type of blip. It's still a technique, but this one is more geared towards addressing some of the difficult externalities that we're only now wrapping our arms around and getting an understanding of with the new digital ecosystem that we live in. We're at an interesting inflection point. We have seen tremendous scale and rapid growth from some digital native companies. Those in social media, for example, you look at Facebook, it was 2004 when Facebook started. The IPO, I think, was less than a decade ago, but look at that scale today. And there's clear benefit in terms of staying connected that a platform like Facebook provides. We're also coming to grips with some of the downside of that global presence that it has, and the algorithmic driven news feeds as an example, the increased polarization. It's obviously not all on social networks like Facebook, but there is a magnification of the effect of the implications of things like misinformation represented on a platform like Facebook or some of those other social networks, the Googles and Twitters of the world as well. But it's true of any product we build. Machine learning products can have implicit bias that can unintentionally introduce, for example, racial bias into the algorithmic decision making. User interfaces, there's a lot of attention now around what they call dark patterns to trick users into paying more money than they should, or to subscribing to mailing lists. And there's some regulatory efforts at curbing that. You look at GPDR, the United States has some momentum towards that, starting with California. So there's regulation that's similar to GPDR that started in California. Other states are starting to look at it. Ethical Explorer is specifically geared as a toolkit towards product teams. So while governments and markets certainly have a voice in this conversation, so do we as developers and folks associated with the delivery of a digital product. And the Ethical Explorer extends some learnings from a previous iteration called Ethical OS, which we also blipped, that is really just a toolkit for facilitated conversation. So you can download the kit for free, fold it up into cards. There's a set of risk zones that they talk about, things like surveillance, and then there'll be questions around surveillance. Can someone use our product or service to track or identify users? And then you have the conversation around that flows into your requirements. It's not a prescribed solution. It's a prescribed set of things that you as a product team have a responsibility to think about to be a responsible citizen in this inflection point that we're all going through as we wrangle what is the appropriate amount of autonomy for digital products versus where do we need to recognize some of the externalities of those digital products. It talks about disinformation, it talks about exclusion, algorithmic bias. I mentioned the machine learning models, addiction. We live very much in a dopamine society where these digital products are all vying for your attention, often in some ways to an extent that's unhealthy for us. Data control, bad actors, and outsized power. And then they have ideas for activities and workshops and conversation starters to generate some amount of organizational buy-in. So I think we're still somewhat early on this journey. I'm happy to see that there are organizations like the one behind Ethical Explorer that are providing a shared set of things for us to think about as we all find our own path through this journey. But these are I think a really fantastic set of questions to ask as you start to think about product development.
This is the stand-in for the required class on ethics that all technologists will eventually have to take. So you can get a head start on that now.
Absolutely. All right, so for our last technique, I thought I'd squeeze this one in because this is actually something that as we were discussing, we thought that everyone knows about this, but we thought, all right, let's just put it on to be as explicit as possible. So what we're trying to put on hold here is the concept of naive password complexity requirements. So as we still see organizations today, and even organizations close to us, as password policies are standard default for many of these organizations today, we're seeing a lot of these passwords are still including, put your symbols in there and numbers and uppercase and lowercase letters and all of these special characters and things like that. And there's a few problems with these types of requirements. One is it's really hard to remember these types of passwords. And so when you can't remember it or you're writing it down somewhere, it sort of defeats the purpose of that security. And then the other bit is they're actually not as safe as, if you're looking at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the recommendation for passwords is really around password strength, around the password length, right? So users really should be using long pass phrases that have a maximum requirement of 64 characters, including spaces. You can actually use sentences that you can actually remember as your passphrases. So this is a simple one, but a very important one, because you don't want to have that false sense of security as you're trying to remember all of these different crazy looking passwords. I mean, really look at these longer passphrases. Again, it's easily to remember, and it's actually more secure by standards. So it's a big one.
One of the things that we tend to default to the same terminology a lot, and one of the things that we've been forced to require is something theater. But I think this would be a variation of security theater, of having all this crazy complexity there, seeming like it's adding some value, but it's really just adding some theatrics to what you're doing. So, but we've sworn off something theater because we overused that. So let's talk about a couple of themes. So we have blips on our radar every time. We usually have about 100 blips on our radar. But, one of the most interesting things that happens during our meetings are the conversations that get generated as we talk through these blips. And in traditional times, over dinner and the other times that we spend together. And so one of the things that we try to do every radar is to distill some themes, sort of some meta conversation stuff that we had around blips, but are related to one another, and something that we're seeing on the ground, and something that is kind of thematically attaches many of the things on the radar together. So we want to talk about a couple of those today as well.
Sure. And this one fits a little bit of a pattern that recurs in our industry. So I've been in the industry a little over 20 years now. And even in that time frame, you start to see things that the industry appears to have abandoned, only later to circle back to them. I think to some extent, if you take a high enough level of abstraction, that same recurrence applies to the cloud sandboxes that Cassie mentioned, because before my time, folks used to work on a dumb terminal where the local machine wasn't where the processing was, but it would connect to the mainframe processing. The cloud sandboxes is, to an extent, a similar pattern. You're working on effectively your dumb terminal of a laptop connected to the processing on the cloud. This is another recurring pattern in our industry. And to an extent, like there's some organizations who are more inclined towards this than others, and Microsoft certainly is one of them. I used to work with Microsoft TFS, which was their sort of all-in-one bundle of developer tools, agile lifecycle management tools. It had source control, it had pipelines, it had project management tools. And then what happened? Well, what happened was Git and Docker and microservices and cloud, and that package no longer made sense. And so there was this great unbundling as we were all navigating our way through this new cloud native distributed world. And we had, some best of breed tool selections. We might go to Circle CI for a hosted CI solution. We might use GitHub Enterprise for source control. We might use Jira for project management. But there's been an effort across a few toolkits, Azure DevOps being Microsoft's sort of reinvention of TFS in this new world is a great example. That's maybe not entirely best of breed, but good enough. And because it's all bundled together, it's very convenient for a lot of developers to use. So it has the wikis and the project management tools, it has the pipelines, and it has the source control the plugins. There's another ecosystem that's quite similar, and its ambition to bundle a bunch of tools together for a convenient developer experience, and that's GitHub. Now, I think they were on that path anyway, but what's interesting to note is Microsoft now owns GitHub as well. There are probably other toolkits that you could make a similar claim to, but they get a little bit further downstream from the project management side. If you look at like Red Hat's OpenShift, that's a good bundle collection of tools that's good enough for a lot of folks. It's pretty good and some of what it does overall. And certainly just saves you the hassle of wiring up all these tools together. So it appears to be a theme that we're seeing. We've seen it certainly with Azure DevOps and GitHub. we have, some experience reports of some specific critiques of specific components of each of those tools as people run into the limitations, but that's somewhat to be expected as you get into that sort of all-in-one package solution. But we also hear a number of our teams saying, yeah, it kind of worked, and it was super convenient because we didn't have to do a lot of wiring. So it's a trend that we expect to continue. There is unquestionable appeal to the idea of a one-stop shop to go to get everything, and just to remove the hassle of having to wire it up. And at least a lot of teams are willing to sacrifice, some slightly better improvements on a specific piece of that puzzle, like better pipelines as an example, because it's just easy to get started.
Yeah, no, and so Brandon, I think, and I was actually kind of looking at some of the Q&A. One of the things that popped up at the bottom is really around low code platforms. And so I encourage everyone to look at our last Tech Radar and actually Brandon doing a podcast on that as well. And that does have that same mentality of, where is that one-stop shop? And I think one thing to note is with boundaries, like trying to really understand what are these things trying to accomplish, and are you able to accomplish that in this trend? So not to over engineer all of the things and being able to do everything at once as well. So.
Right. This is the theme that Cassie teed up earlier. It's related to the blip that is an adopt. So there's some passion from the Doppler, from Thoughtworks, from the industry around using platform teams to scale. We've seen a lot of benefit from that X as a service, self-service mentality of thinking of a platform as an ecosystem of composable products that are self-service that you can stitch together to accelerate the delivery of something that matters to the business or to the market. Because that's the difference. The platforms, products, customers are other delivery teams who then deliver to the market. What the advantage of working at a consultancy like Thoughtworks is that we get visibility to a lot of different attempts that organizations have made to implement platform teams. And we see a lot of different interesting team models. We have some natural biases around what we think are good ways of working. And then we have the advantage of being able to validate or invalidate some of that across organizations as they move, take early steps down that journey. And we get to see some of the anti-patterns, the things that don't appear to be working. So we feel pretty comfortable with what Cassie described as, hey, take this product thinking mentality, treat your delivery teams as customers, and build self-service capabilities based on team topologies and other patterns towards that ambition. But we also see some anti-patterns. We've seen a couple organizations now who have, I mentioned OpenShift in the previous theme. They might buy OpenShift, which is a fantastic API-driven product, and then put tickets in front of them because they're used to managing things like quotas through manual processes. So they'll take a system, an expensive system, go and implement it. That system automates service fulfillment for things like provisioning, but then they'll put a ticketing system to just automate service requests so that they can manually implement the service fulfillment and manage things that they feel like they need to manage out of band that way. We've seen similar patterns with people moving to the cloud, putting ticketing systems in front of the cloud. We have another, to my point I made previously about patterns that recur. Another historical pattern that the industry moved away from was this idea of organizing teams around layers. 20 years ago, when all we built were more or less what we would today call monoliths, a somewhat common pattern was for an organization to take a large project around building a monolithic application and have a front-end team, a business rules team, and a data team, even though it was all one product. We reorganized the axes of how we think about team design subsequent to that time frame. We said, hey, let's vertically slice, and oh, guess what? Because it's too much for one team to do, maybe that means we need to reduce the surface area of what the product delivers, and that was that drive towards distribution that we live in now. But that pattern, we've seen it recur with platform team organizations. So we've seen some organizations who have said, the experienced teams are not allowed to build any business rules. We have the multiple teams who are building APIs around business rules, but then they have to coordinate their activities with multiple teams who are building data aspects of the platform. And so instead of getting domain orientation, like maybe I want to give you, some inventory management and an API and have the data ownership within that domain, we see some organizations who are still struggling to make that shift by resurrecting an old layered approach and now applying it in the context of the platforms. So there certainly are some ways that you can trip over your shoelaces down this path. It's not an easy path. Platform, if building software platforms was easy, everybody would be doing it. There's tremendous value, especially once you reach a certain scale to doing it. But there are a number of anti-patterns along the way, and we tried to at least call out some of those in this radar.
Yeah, absolutely, Brandon. And I think, kind of reading through some of the questions as well, so won't get to all of them, but I think Brandon's actually answered quite a few of those. But if you think about the makeup of, platform teams and in itself, again, to reiterate, really around forming these platform teams around these vertical capabilities, right? So we think about the engineers being the customer. What are the technical capabilities that we need to build the platform for? So I think I mentioned like observability would be one, security, being able to build out your delivery infrastructure. These are capabilities that the engineers actually need from a platform point of view. So designing those teams around that is really important. A lot of platform teams that we see right now have the concept of technical product owners. So if you think about a traditional product owner really driving out feature development, like what does the customer actually need, a technical product owner would really look at what does, for example, logging and observability actually look like? What does that need to be standardized on, and really driving out those requirements, much like you would do in a feature set. So just some thoughts, in terms of like how you organize your platform teams and things like that. So.
So we've got some great questions. And one thing I'll mention about platforms is, since we've been talking about platforms, one of the things that we observe often at the radar meetings is this issue that Martin Feller brings up and has actually written a blog entry about semantic diffusion of terms in the technology world, that, eventually terms stop meaning anything because they get so overused. And platform has officially hit the semantic diffusion point in the software world, because every company uses the word platform and every company has a different definition for what a platform is. So maybe the first thing you need to do is hammer down, what do we actually mean by platform and platform team? There were a lot of questions in the Q&A about ownership, but that's either answered by Brandon or an implementation detail for your organization, because we can't really tell you how your organization is organized and therefore how you should optimally organize your platform teams. But there's a great question here about product teams. How can you adapt this in a thin IT organization, and how can you encourage collaboration with the platform engineering team if you do have that? So, it seems like something, if you have a lot of resources, it's easier to do. But what if you have a very cost conscious, very thin, stretched IT organization?
Well, I'll give my initial response, and then Cassie, feel free to chime in. I think software platforms, and again, to Neil's point, there's business platforms, or it's easy to misinterpret the word. Software platforms really only start to make sense at a certain scale, because it is a scale play. It's how you will never justify the expense of a platform in the context of a specific product or a specific project, because it's always going to be cheaper and faster in the context of one product to just build the product. It only makes sense across a portfolio. And so if you aren't an organization that has concerns across a portfolio, then maybe you're not. Cassie used that metaphor, you had to be this tall to do something. Well, maybe you're just not tall enough as an organization to start going down the platform journey, and that's okay. It actually hurt you if you did prematurely, because you would slow yourself down and cause more money, cause more expense. That said, if you are big enough, one of the trigger words for me in that question was collaborate. Like, I think if you are relying on a high degree of collaboration, that means you're still discovering what the appropriate platform capabilities are. and you probably need some joint exploration amongst the people who ultimately, build the platform and ultimately own the user experience on top. You might not be there yet. The idea of a platform is to prevent teams from having to talk to each other, not to facilitate them talking to each other. They talk to each other through APIs. That's why it's a scaling pattern. And that is, I think, key to their success. If you're always having to collaborate on usage, then it's not really self-service. You haven't given yourself the benefit of modularity and Lego blocks that you can build something up with. So I do think there is a notion of figure out where you are in the life cycle. Are you big enough? Yes. Okay, great. Are you confident that you understand what the right platform capabilities to build are? No. Well, then maybe you need a collaborative model until you are. And then you can figure out what the right model is once you're comfortable with that.
Okay, so I thought Cassie was going to add something. So here's a question. So, nothing else to add. So here's a question from Jason Yip, which is sort of abstract and philosophical. I know that's a huge shocker, but it touches on two of the things that you talked about. So it nicely wraps up two things that we've been talking about. How much do you think these recurring patterns, I assume the consolidated convenience and some of the platform stuff we've been talking about, these recurring patterns of structure are actually a reflection of what's becoming utility or commodity versus what's becoming strategic? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I can take a crack at this one. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that I've been recently talking about, especially like in the cloud space, about what is commodity and then what is your differentiator. I think just asking that question is one of the most important first steps to really, in your organization, figuring out like what are all of these utility commodity type of things that could be any platform could actually, and because thinking about the platform itself is really around abstracting some of the things that we shouldn't have to think about all the time because they are commodity type of things. And really what we want to do is get our engineers, our developers to really think about and put our talent into the differentiated things for our organization, those special features, maybe an AI platform, maybe something that is really going to differentiate your organization. So really driving your talent and putting more resources in that, and then being able to abstract away all of that cognitive overhead that is essentially a utility or a commodity. So that's my first crack at it. But if anyone else has anything to add.
But yeah, and I think when you get to things like GitHub and Azure DevOps, I think it's maybe an interesting question as to whether we have wrapped our brain around the patterns of pipelines enough, for example, to say, hey, pipeline tooling is itself becoming commoditized, and therefore it's just easy to bundle into something and make that something you don't spend a lot of time setting up the infrastructure for. Obviously, you'll spend some time configuring your instance of a pipeline. I do think that's an interesting question. I think it's, if it's not there, it's certainly getting close. It's certainly productized in that sort of wordly mapping lifecycle. For sure, the project management tools are pretty close to that space too. So I appreciate the question. I don't know that I have a well thought out answer, but I think there are components of it that are moving towards that direction.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it is. I agree with both of you that it's really an example of, just the abstraction layers getting deeper and deeper in the software development world, because, and this is going to expose my age, but I remember a big deal back in the early days was what kind of network protocol are you using? Is it TCP/IP? Is it IPX, SPX, and a bunch of stuff that you never think about anymore? It's just there. It's just part of the abstraction stack, and in fact, it never even breaks, so you have to go dig around and figure out why it's broken. So I think more and more of these things are going to become commodities as they become more and more standard pieces of developer building blocks. So here's a little bit of a controversial question that's maybe a little bit buzzword bingo, but do platform teams mean that DevOps has failed in an organization?
DevOps is another one of those words that's under semantic diffusion that Neil talked about. And so I've actually tried to stop using the word just because of that, because it means different things to different folks. There was an original common understanding of DevOps in the early days that involved increased collaboration between dev and ops, increased empathy for the concerns that each side faced, increased automation for ops, increased op awareness, production awareness for dev. That is clearly valuable, but the sort of naive scaling factor for that is, well, you just have, you know, an ops person on every dev team, and there's not enough ops people for that. That collaborative model doesn't scale. So I think if that is your frame for what DevOps means, then yes, the platform team model, the X as a service, the self-service capability model does mean that we found a better scaling model than a naive understanding of DevOps as collaboration. However, I clearly a number of folks were thinking in this space, sort of, you know, using APIs for scale and developer experience and the DevOps mentality. So I think it's too much of a blanket statement to say DevOps has failed. I think it's there's a lot of gray area in the interpretation that each of us had around what DevOps meant.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, Brandon, you know, something that you just said is it's really around the empathy for like the operations pieces, like all of the different non-functional requirements and things that an organization has to think about. I think the empathy still has to be there, right? Even on platform teams, even more so to really understand what does that actually mean, but then being able to abstract that away. So we don't want to hide from it and say, oh, somebody else will take care of it. You want to actually drive some of those requirements as an engineer to really, you know, make it more of, we talked about commodity, make it more of something that is out of the box, as opposed to just throwing it over some wall saying, oh, operations will take care of it, right? So I think platform teams and actually really thinking about the empathy between engineers and operations, like that goes hand in hand. So let's not switch it around. So yeah.
So there are a couple of interesting questions here about mob programming. Someone said that they actually prefer the phrase remote collaborative programming, but I actually disagree with that. I like mob because mob has a great connotation of, you know, an unruly bunch that's getting together to, you know, solve some kind of problem. But the more pertinent part of this, of course, is, are there any particular tools other than VS Code, which obviously facilitates that, but what kind of tooling have you used to do mob programming?
So a lot of times in the mob programming, there's more people viewing than typing, which gives you more flexibility because then you can use things like Zoom and Teams and so forth. When you actually need multi-edit capability, though I think it only supports 2 or 3 people editing at one time. Another blip that made it to this radar is a tool called Tuple, which is still somewhat early in its product development, filling in the hole that for those of you who are familiar with Screen Hero, used to fill a few years ago before Slack abandoned it. Tuple right now only works for the Mac. They're quickly moving towards Linux, but it still doesn't have Windows support. There's still some growing pains with it, but it does provide some of that multi-edit capability. Now you can't swarm or mob or collaborate with, you know, 15 people in one tuple instance, but you can get more capability around multi-edit than you can get with most tools like the one we're using right now.
Yeah, I agreed with that. I think the one thing I will kind of call out on this one as well is that some of it's about whiteboarding as well, not just going into the ID. It's really that collaborative function of it. So if you don't feel like you have the correct tooling to really be mob programming, don't stop. Like still set up time to actually work with your teams and actually figure out, like, hey, is this more of a conversation about a piece of code? Could we do some pseudocode on a whiteboard as opposed to having to go directly to the IDE? So just some thoughts around that, because the purpose of this blip is really to keep enabling collaboration, especially in this remote world, because it is actually much easier when everybody's, you know, on their computer.
So there's a question here, is semantic diffusion susceptible to semantic diffusion? Well, of course it is, just like the word succinct describes itself, so we don't have to even bother answering that one. So one last question here, or maybe a couple more. We're getting close to out of time, and we realize that. In your opinion, what does it mean to be big enough for a platform team? Is it maturity of product? engineering team size, or maybe the number of maintained services, or do you have some guidelines around what are the correct seams to create a product team within an organization? What are some of the drivers? Now, there can't be just one, but what are some of the factors?
So, I mean, we have some interesting experience reports as the digital native companies went down that journey. If you look at where Amazon and Netflix both started breaking up their monolithic systems, it was, if memory serves, it was roughly when their engineering size reached about 100 folks. And what happens, of course, is you start tripping over each other's shoelaces in that model, because if you have multiple teams in the same code, well, who when a build breaks, like who does it go to? When there's a defect, who does it go to? How do you coordinate releases? There's a lot of coordination challenges that the platform model is meant to solve. What used to be coordination, talking to people, is now done through automation. So that is a rough rubric. I think, I'd love to hear, Cassie, your response, but that's sort of, it's engineering size driven primarily, I think, and sort of that 100-person point has happened historically to Amazon and Netflix.
Yeah. And that number is actually, I've seen a bit in some of these digitally native companies. I think one thing that we have seen that a platform team really helps out with is when you think about some of these digitally native companies and they have feature-driven teams who have really strong autonomy within each team. One downside to that is that each of these teams are reinventing the wheel across the entire stack by themselves, right? So one, there's multiple forms of auth. There's multiple, libraries for security. There's multiple things because each team is really driving in their autonomous way. So if you're starting to see your company having multiple different implementations for actually what we talked about, a utility type of implementation, that might be a sign that you need to start looking at what that consolidation could look like from a platform point of view. So,
yeah, I think people are starting to realize that there are two kinds of reuse in organizations. There's that kind of utilitarian IT kind of reuse, but then there's domain reuse. And you really need two different levels of reuse in your organization, because if you couple the domain stuff as tightly as the operational stuff, then it gets you in trouble. So a lot of platform teams, I think, are figuring out reuse boundaries around, what's the right level of exposure to reuse versus encapsulation and consolidation. So I think that's a journey a lot of our clients are going on right now. And of course, it's just adding to the semantic diffusion problem of the word platform, of course. So it looks like we are just about out of time. So I will say thank you very much to our fantastic participants and all your very, very good questions. Thank you very much to Cassie and Brandon for both helping put the radar together and volunteering to help enlighten people about the sneak peek of what people haven't been able to see yet, but we'll get to see very soon. So our radar will be coming out shortly. Thanks once again for coming and visiting with us. Hope you enjoy the radar and hope you come back for one of our future sneak peek events. Thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day.